audible because I tested just now and I came out like Mickey Mouse.
No, you are, and you're sounding completely normal.
That's brilliant. Thank you.
Sadly, because that would have been much more fun.
Yeah, it was a bit incomprehensible. It was a very squeaky Mickey Mouse.
Okay, well, the chipmunk stick. Yeah. Shall we crack on, seeing as we are now live streaming? Right. Okay. Shall I start? Okay, everybody. Welcome to everybody here. I'd particularly like to welcome Caroline Green, who's the city's CEO, and Susan Brown, who's the leader of the council. It's very good to have you here this evening, and we're looking forward to your presentations. So what we'd like to do, having done apologies and declarations of interest, is I'd like to ask the members of the committee if they'd agree to your two items, Caroline's and Susan's coming first. That's the council business plan update and the recovery and renewal network. I think that makes sense. We've got two very busy people here. Are you all happy that we take those and then go back to the standard agenda afterwards? Great, I see some thumbs and nobody shaking their heads. So Alice, can we have apologies, please?
Of course. So we've had apologies from Councillor Fry, we've had apologies from Councillor Tidball, and Councillor Diggins will be subbing for her. And we've had apologies from Councillor Waite, and we've got Councillor Coyne subbing for her. Right, thank you very much, and thank you for all the people subbing. It's a big deal having to read all the papers, sometimes at quite short notice, and I'm grateful. Declarations of interest. Do we have any at this stage? Nobody's looking as though they might have a declaration, but obviously if something comes up at a later stage, just put your hand up, your virtual hand, and let us know. I have no announcements, except to say that Caroline Green has very kindly agreed to take over Mish Tuller's role for the purposes of these two fairly major reports this evening, and we're very grateful. So I'd like to pass over now to Susan and to Caroline, and I don't know which of you will be starting the presentation.
Shall I kick off and then Caroline can add much more helpful stuff, I'm sure. So I'm taking it we're doing corporate business plan first. That's the first one on the agenda, isn't it? Yes.
Thank you.
Sorry, I've got the reports but not the scrutiny agenda in front of me. So yeah, so this is of course looking ahead to year 3 of our 4-year business plan for the City Council, and we have spent some time over the last few years trying to make sure that we were being realistic in our objectives and narrowing them down so that we can really focus in on the things that we absolutely must achieve if we're to meet our aims as overall aims as a council. And I think this report sets them out well, and I'm obviously very happy to answer detailed questions on that. The Priority 1, enabling an inclusive economy, I think we're making good progress against that. One of the things that we're going to be doing next year, set out in the business plan, is implementing the new procurement strategy. And I think that will be very much welcomed by Scrutiny. I know that it's something that Scrutiny's talked about in the past. And, you know, I think we all share an agenda that we want to improve our local procurement wherever we can, so adding social value to the city. And that's very much what this is all about. We're also looking at how we can develop an inclusive economy charter for the city, and that's very much again something I think that would be supported by people across the council in terms of trying to ensure that we're working with employers to be inclusive in every way. So obviously people will be very familiar with the work that we've done on the Oxford Living Wage, which is about trying to make sure that employment is paid well in the city, but there's also issues around people's life experiences or their health issues, disability, and these are also issues that we would want to be working with local employers about. I mean, one of the things I'd just like to say is that I think we've done some really excellent work over the last year in trying to, not just last year, actually the last couple of years, in engaging with key other stakeholders in this space. And one of the really the things that I'm quite excited about is the fact that we're taking this message about an inclusive economy not just to businesses and employers in Oxford, but across the whole of Oxfordshire. And there's now quite an important piece of work that's happening as a kind of subset of the work that we do as part of the Future Oxfordshire Partnership, all about the inclusive economy. And that feels to me like a really good piece of leadership work that we're doing as a City Council. I'm not going to, you will be pleased to hear, sort of linger over every single objective in here, because otherwise we'll be here all day and I'm sure people will have questions. But I just wanted to pick out a couple from sort of each section. So on priority 2, which is delivering more affordable housing, again, I think we are making good progress. We're delivering a new housing, homelessness and rough sleeping strategy for Oxford. That's really crucial, obviously, to tackling a situation which, very sadly, over the last 12 years has seen us go from having almost zero rough sleeping to having had a very sad increase in rough sleeping, and that timetable is, of course, not coincidental. We had, under the last Labour government, pretty much almost entirely got rid of rough sleeping, enabled people to have homes of their own. And now we are back in a situation, unfortunately, where housing has become very difficult for people. And that remains a real challenge. But there are lots of actions that we're taking, working again with partners across the piece to try and tackle these issues, and that's set out again in the report. And of course, as we know, one of the real difficulties for us in the city is the large amount of private rented sector accommodation. And one of the things that I'm really pleased about is the fact that we have managed to put together a bid and submit it, and obviously still waiting to hear whether we've been successful, to have a private housing scheme, registration scheme, which I think will really help us to drive up standards in the private rented sector in the city. So good news on that front. And obviously, if that does, if we do hear that we've been successful, that'll be a really big piece of work for us going forward. We also have as a key priority supporting thriving communities, and that's something that's very important to us, because we know that many communities in our city are quite challenged for all the reasons that we've just been discussing, because we have got quite a divided economy in our city, where we've got some very wealthy people but also some people living in poverty, and we're very conscious that a fifth of children in our city grow up in poverty, and it's considerably more than that in some areas of the city. So one of the things we've been very focused on as a city council is making sure that we are doing everything we can to enable everybody in our city to be properly engaged in all of the different provisions that we make, whether in terms of the community and leisure facilities. So things like providing free swimming for children is really important to us, and making sure that we're providing subsidies for our leisure facilities for people who are on no incomes. We're very proud of our parks and public spaces, and I think we continue to make sure that we're putting in place plenty of activities across the city and supporting keeping our parks beautiful. And I have to say, I do think that we do that. I've been around a number of other cities recently, and noting that a number of parks there look pretty shabby in comparison to ours. So I think we can be genuinely very proud of the work that goes into keeping our parks beautiful, which is not just the City Council services, but also the many volunteers across the city who help keep our parks clean and litter pick and so on, which we're duly grateful for. Fourth priority, and these aren't in any particular order, is to pursue a zero carbon Oxford, and that's of course completely crucial for the future of our city and the future of our planet. And we have made some fairly firm very firm commitments as a city, both in terms of our own tasks to achieve as a city council, but also as a city, and I think have made good progress over the last couple of years in terms of setting out the roadmap to get there, and working with partners to try and achieve that. So obviously over the last year, we've been putting a lot of work into our leisure centres and decarbonising them. That work is continuing. We also want to accelerate our council house retrofit programme, and that is going to be some key work for us to do as we go forward. We know that one of the biggest issues for us as a city is the buildings that are already there, and decarbonising those buildings. So retrofitting has got to be a key part of the work that we do as we go forward. I think I'm going to stop there because otherwise I could go on all night. I suspect people may have some questions and comments and so on, but Caroline might want to add some items. Oh, you're muted, Liz.
Thank you very much, Susan. Caroline, would you like to add anything at this stage?
Yes, I'll keep my comments relatively brief for the reasons Susan said. Make I'm sure people have got questions. And I think this is somewhat of an annual event. So I hope some members at least are familiar with this process. I just wanted to reiterate a couple of points which are in the covering report. The purpose of the annual business plan is to set out the key actions that will deliver against our priority. So it's not an exhaustive list and description of everything that we do across the council. We have had a deliberate effort this year to try and really be focused on focus down on some real key deliverables on the basis of two things really. One, we asked ourselves the question, are they genuinely transformational in their impact, either in terms of the strategic impact or the scale of the impact that they will have in terms of achieving the objectives that we set out in our corporate strategy. And secondly, that they are not considered. We do many other things which are very important, but are business as usual. In some ways, these are extraordinary actions. And I'd also say that they are, though, also aligned with and they follow on from the budget, which Council has obviously recently agreed. So things which are in here are things which we have identified the resources for and got plans around for delivering. We have slimmed it down from previous years. I think we got feedback that, previous iterations of our business plan have been very long and very difficult, therefore, to see exactly, where the priorities are. But there are a number of other projects which are still being taken forward, and they will be set out in the service plans, which are the sort of next suite that sit underneath the delivery of this. A couple of other things I just wanted to say, as well as looking to the future, which I think is the basis for our discussion this evening, but it also does give you a report back on some of the key achievements last year. And I just want to say that in developing and reading that, I think it's really quite an impressive story, given that we had a further year of disruption from COVID, which continued to impact quite heavily on our resources and requiring us to respond. So I think it's really impressive that despite that, and I'm really proud that we were able to achieve things like progressing with the Oxfordshire Inclusive Economy Partnership, the progress and traction that we've built around the Zero Carbon Oxford Partnership, and related to that, I think a project particularly impressive to have done this year was the decarbonisation of the leisure centres, a hugely complex programme. And delivering the largest EV charging hub. So I think hopefully that gives you a flavour that we were able to deliver against the majority of our plans that we set out last year. But we are trying to streamline and focus on those which we think will really have the biggest impact in the next 2 years. So the other thing I wanted to just flag is, and this might come back to this in questions, is that we are also reviewing the KPIs that will be the way in which we measure progress against our objectives here. And I'm looking towards Tom, but I believe that is coming forward in a report to the Finance and Performance Committee of the Scrutiny panel. So we will have a fuller conversation about the suite of measures which we are reviewing and updating, partly as a result of COVID and partly to try and simplify them in terms of measures of our success. So I'll probably end my introductory bit there. but sorry, one last thing. As you'll appreciate, there's a huge amount of work involved in this. I may not be able to answer all of your detailed questions. Hopefully we can talk about anything that needs clarifying. But if you've got particular questions about elements of the projects, I think it's probably better use of Scrutiny's time that we take those away and come back to you, unless I'm able to answer them pretty succinctly this evening.
Thank you very much, Susan and Caroline. It's a very high-level report, and I'm sure you're right that if we have recommendations we want to bring forward this evening, they should be on that high level rather than on smaller local issues for our wards or for specific things that individuals on this committee think are important. But we'll see how it goes. Anyhow, time for questions and comments. Dick, and then Chris, and then Paula, and then Linda. Okay, so Dick first.
Thank you, Liz. This is kind of part question and part comment. You say this is a kind of high level plan, which I guess it is. I'm wondering how it relates to the Oxford Economic Strategy. Now, in introducing that idea, I did a sort of quick check of how many strategies and plans there are around the county, and there's about 34 different strategies and plans. It's chaos out there, paperwork everywhere. But obviously the Oxford Economic Strategy relates to this, must do, and that's recently been consulted on. I don't know how the timings of the development of these various plans and strategies works, but I have to say, I mean, our group discussed economic strategy and we sort of felt that it read like something that might have been produced 5 years ago, whereas this business plan doesn't. A preface, a comment that we had a very interesting discussion on the child poverty review group, which I was depping on the other day, and the word inclusive was used, but in terms of inclusive growth rather than inclusive economy. And I thought that was really very interesting. The questions that an inclusive growth approach takes is that it looks at plans for developing the economy and says, okay, and who benefits from this? Where does the benefit lie? Does it create problems? Will it worsen inequality? And I think the trajectory we've been on in previous years has worsened inequality. I think there hasn't been a joined up sort of approach. So I think our growth drive has promoted inequality, and you end up with the council then trying to pick up the pieces of the problems it causes in housing and in all sorts of other ways. Lack of access to training and education and appropriate job opportunities, all that stuff. So my question is around this. The business plan uses a talk about inclusive economy, and I identify some of the things that are in there. Obviously, the procurement strategy, which we've been working on, will also address this to a fair extent. I haven't personally got so involved in that, but clearly that's key. So my question is, I mean, I don't know what's happened to the Oxford Economic Strategy as a result of the consultation. I don't know what the consultation responses have been, but would it be fair to say that actually there are some fairly significant mismatches between this business plan, which I think is much more on target in terms of inclusive growth, and an Oxford Economic Strategy, which feels to me dated and missing target? You know, and I don't really know what the relationship between the two is anyway. So it's a comment and a question. Thanks.
So would you like to answer, Susan or Caroline?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I mean, the report very specifically says that, you know, one of the things that was listed in the business plan was the creation of the development of an Oxford Economic Strategy, as well as the City Centre Action Plan. So, I mean, yes, of course, there are a number of strategies, particularly look across the whole county, that fall out from underneath different, you know, overarching business plans for different organisations. I don't think that's a great surprise. And, you know, there are, you're right, it's important that they talk to each other and they share the same basic aims and priorities. I feel that they do. I think that you will, I'm sure the have an opportunity to get another report back on the economic strategy. We're just working through the consultation responses at the moment, but they were broadly supportive of the economic strategy's aims. There were specific points being raised by different people, and I'm aware that there was quite an orchestrated campaign against some aspects of it, including the use of the word growth. But I mean, I would sort of challenge your the way that you think that it is talking about growth, if you like, because I think what the economic strategy does is to recognise the fact that growth is happening in our city, whether you like it or not, and to try and ensure that the growth that happens in our local economy is inclusive and is sustainable. And we're not in a position of being able to sort of stick a finger in that particular dike to stop the water coming through in terms of the growth and jobs. They are happening. We are incredibly fortunate in Oxford in that we have some amazing talent, some amazing innovation and amazing research. We are world leaders, as we have seen during this pandemic, in health research and science and innovation in particular, but in a number of other fields as well, and increasingly actually in in issues coming out of the sustainability agenda as well. And as a result of that, people are going to want to locate here, and they are going to come to us and want to create jobs. Many other places would be delighted to have our problems. So we can't stop that from happening. There literally isn't any way in which we can stop it from happening. But what we can do is try and work with those organisations to make sure that when they come here and when they are creating new jobs, they are doing it in a sustainable way, and they are taking local people with them. They are helping us in terms of the provision of housing. They are making sure that we are skilling up local people and providing opportunities for them. So that is what we are seeking to do with with our economic strategy, and I think that falls very neatly from the business plan, because that is the overarching aims of our business plan too. I hope that sort of addresses the questions.
Yeah, thank you. Chris, your question or comment?
Thank you. Quite a high level question about the tension between high level priorities 1 and 2, 1 being inclusive economy and 2 being affordable housing. What I mean by that is, so obviously we've currently got a city which is a net commuter sink. It employs considerably more people than it houses working age people, certainly, possibly slightly more than it houses people, full stop. And so we're a net commuter sink. It results in a high cost of living, and so the case for priority 2 is plain as day. The need for affordable housing, just more housing, full stop. Fantastic. But then, as part of priority 1, part of that is about delivering more workspace. And probably the sort of poster child example of this is Oxford, which sort of makes no bones about the fact that it will employ several thousand more people than it can house, though it does contribute some housing. And so to a degree that kind of pulls against priority 2 by increasing demand for people to come into the city to work, and therefore demand for people to live in proximity to those new employment sites. So to us, you see what I mean? The counterwise pull between, on the one hand, delivering housing, and on the other hand, adopting strategies that create more housing demand. So I'd be interested to hear how you square those off, and how we can avoid just undoing the good work of priority 2.
Thank you. Susan or Caroline, would you like to come back on that?
Yep. Happy to. I mean, you're right, Chris. There are some real tensions there, which I would freely acknowledge, that it's difficult to get that balance right. One of the things that we have not done, if you like, is to allocate new land for economic development over the last, I don't know how many years. So, all the sites we're talking about, for instance, the Oxford one, that's been an economic site, largely economic, for a very long time. As I said, these jobs are coming anyway, and I think it is our job as a council to make sure that we manage this in the best way possible. And one of the things that we absolutely recognise is that the city is going to be a draw for people for jobs. That's not a surprise. Cities everywhere tend to be centres of employment. The key from our perspective is to make sure that jobs are located near to transport hubs, and obviously, to use Oxford again as an example, I mean, that's pretty near perfect from that particular perspective, because it's in the city centre, well served by buses, right next to a train station. So there are plenty of ways for people to get there, actually on foot, by bike, and also by train and by bus. So, if you're talking about sustainability, then it's a very sustainable location. In terms of housing, we have made no bones about the fact that we think that urban extensions are the most sustainable way of providing housing for the city, because again, for the reason of sustainable transport links and the ability for people to get easily to jobs, which otherwise, as we know, they end up commuting from afar by car to go to, and we do see this. We see a lot of people commuting into the city by car, and we know that many of those people would actually like to be living in the city or very near the city, because that's where their families are, that's where they grew up, and that's where their jobs are. So that is the balance that we have to achieve. And some of the other thoughts that I would share with you around Oxford are that we will, out of money that the council make from Oxford, we will be able to put more money into buying more affordable housing, building it and acquiring it. And that is, again, one of those things where you have to sort of balance up different needs and different ways of achieving them, but that is we need money to build affordable housing. The government does not give us money to build affordable housing. We have to find it, and that is one of the ways in which we find it.
Thank you very much. Paula, your question.
Yeah, thank you. That sort of links nicely into the question I wanted to ask as well, around, because obviously we have really high rent prices in the private sector, and I liked that in the report it has you work with landlords to improve the quality, and the selective licensing is brilliant. I'm just wondering what other ways can the council kind of work with landlords and even the universities who own a lot of land to try and get, instead of like, I mean, building affordable housing is important, but what about all of the land that is currently in use? Is there any way that we can work with both the landlords and the universities to try and get like some kind of agreement? Because I know that like with the universities, they obviously want to extend some more student accommodation, but the pricing of that tends to make students then go into the private sector. So that there's a lot of like difficulties with it. And yeah, like you said, people want to move here, and a lot of people commute by car, so it creates those types of problems. So I think I just wanted to know, like, is there anything that can, I know we've talked before about the rent cap and that's not a possibility, but is there anything that the council can do with landlords or universities to try and make them do a bit more?
Do you want me to answer this?
Please.
So it's difficult. I mean, I think one of the things that we do is require the universities to build as much purpose-built student accommodation as possible, because we know that currently, particularly in terms of Oxford Brookes, there are a lot of students living in private rented accommodation which could otherwise be occupied by families, and that pushes up rents for ordinary families in the city. So we have been pursuing that policy for some years now. It's been pretty successful with the University of Oxford. Largely speaking, nearly all undergraduate students at the University of Oxford now live in purpose-built accommodation. That was not the case a number of years ago. So we have seen that particular student population sort of exit largely from the private rented market. I mean, not entirely, because there is still an element of choice, but largely speaking, unless they're graduate students, which is slightly different, but even then there's a great deal more purpose-built graduate accommodation. Oxford Brookes, obviously that is that is increasing the amount of accommodation that they're building for students, and that should help. But it's not a panacea. There are other things that we have lobbied about and not necessarily managed to get to achieve success on. One of them is the loss of again family housing in the city to short-term lets like Airbnb. And again, that puts upward pressure on rents, because people feel that they can get more money out of the occasional let of their property through Airbnb, and it's a loss of accommodation into the private rented sector, thus pushing rents up even more. So, that remains, from my perspective, a very key lobbying point, and I never lose an opportunity of talking to other council leaders and to policymakers at a national level, of raising that issue, because I really want us to be able to have the powers to do something about it. And at the moment, our powers are very limited indeed. We have some very limited planning powers to sort of try and control some of that, but they are limited. And I think the final area which we are considering looking at and should do is the building of purpose-built affordable rent properties. So in other words, not properties that are social rents, not council housing in that traditional sense, but houses where houses and flats where people wouldn't have to meet criteria to get into them, other than being able to afford the rent, and those would be at lower than market rent, but still sort of turning some kind of level of profit to the council in order to allow us to manage to run them. So, that is something that we have considered and we will continue to consider, but getting that balance right is going to be tricky, particularly going forward when there's huge demands, as we know, on every bit of housing land, and none of the housing land in Oxford is easy to develop. It's all expensive to develop, which means that we have to make some difficult choices sometimes about which route we go down with each individual site. That is something to consider for the future.
Thank you very much. Linda, can we hear your comment or question?
Thank you. Yeah, I've got issues I'd like to raise in 5 areas, actually. So the first one is on bathing water. It seems like we're a bit out of date there, because the government went out to consultation on one of the spots and the consultation is now closed. So it'd be good to update that, and perhaps even have a line in there about where we might go, regardless of the result. What we do if it's successful, and some thoughts maybe about what we do if it's not. I realise this is a high-level document, but I'm just thinking in terms of perhaps providing information to swimmers about water quality, improving safety, facilities in spots where people swim, and even perhaps longer term thinking about how we can facilitate safer open water swimming. Secondly, Ox pens. It's good that it's very clear that development should not be at the expense of the vibrancy of the existing centre. Could we have just a little bit more detail in there about how we hope to achieve that? Does that mean it's going to be light on retail? If so, perhaps we should be clear about that. In the section on affordable housing, it says that we'll do regeneration schemes and build affordable housing at the same time as improving public spaces. I do find that a bit hard to reconcile with the plans of our housing company to build on Sandy Lane recreation ground. If we're serious about that, about improving public spaces, perhaps we do need a commitment in this business plan about protecting public spaces, because that's the first, that's more important than improving them, is protecting the ones we've got. And linked to that, in the same section, it says sites valued by local people for leisure and recreation will be protected. Well, I'd like some detail about how we gauge that, before we decide that sites are surplus to requirements. On the thriving communities section, we've got it says there that citizens will increase their active engagement in civic and political life, but no further detail about how that will be achieved. It looks like it's sort of incomplete almost. It did make me think about conversations that I had with Nadeem Materja when he was here about a youth council. I think that's a really interesting idea which I'd like to see taken forward, and perhaps that is something we could mention there. Finally, page 50, the movement of people and goods into and within the city will have improved, resulting in less traffic congestion, better air quality and faster journey times. In light of the tragic accident last week, and all the history behind that, unfortunately, of fatalities on our roads and serious accidents on our roads, I think we really should mention a reduction in road traffic accidents there as well, and improved safety for road users. We might even want to flesh that out by thinking about, because we've got some measures, some tools in our box which are mentioned there. Perhaps we could think about restrictions on HGVs coming into the city, either within certain hours or unless vehicles have got certain safety features, but perhaps that's a bit too much detail. But and also in that section we have got, it does say, including the creation of, we will create more spaces for pedestrian access, including the creation of low traffic neighbourhoods, and a bit more detail there about why we have asked for a pause in that programme. I would like to see a recognition of the importance of consultation, community consultation, and listening to residents and working with residents on the development of these schemes. I think, given where we've got to with that programme and all the flaws of the county's work in that area so far, I think that would be an important thing to say that we value. That's my contribution. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Linda. I think I've written down about 6 recommendations from that, but I will refine them in a moment if that's okay with you. I don't know if you want to respond to that, or you'd like to hear Nigel first and then maybe respond to Linda and Nigel together.
Why don't I try and take them together, because I'm still trying to digest the various different points that Linda made. I might have to ask to send them in writing, frankly.
Well, Susan, unfortunately, I've got rather a long list as well. I just wonder whether that's really practical. I mean, I've got about 4 or 5 points as well, so we might really lose our way if we have about 10 things to talk about. I don't really want to.
Could I come back on a couple of Linda's points, Chair?
Yeah.
So I think that there was quite a few in there and helpful. I think some of them we can tick off quite easily, like updating the bit on the bathing water status. I think you're right, things have moved on since the original drafting, so that's really helpful. I just wanted to also say that I think, Linda, some of your comments were referring to the things we've defined as objectives, which are taken out of the strategy. So this is about how we're delivering against them rather than debating the things which are confirmed in the strategy. But I think you've made a couple of suggestions there about looking at the wording of some of these to make sure that it's really reflecting fully what we're doing on each of those. But a couple of your other points. So I think your question around ox pens and the not expensive, the vibrancy of areas and protection of leisure space. I mean that how we those are policies which are also set out in our local plan, and I think the KPIs that we're discussing are ways in which we're going to be measuring outcomes against that. So if I'm right, I think your questions there are partly about how we're going to measure against our policies, rather than describing them as our key actions in the plan. I think you make a really good point about there's why is there nothing against the increase in civic and political engagement in civic life. Well, I should have just said this at the beginning, which is a number of the actions are relevant to more than one of the priorities, but they only appear in the plan once to avoid duplication. So I think there are things we might cross-reference that. I think there are things in the actions which do speak to that. So, for example, the work around a community campaign and engagement on zero carbon communities, I think you could equally make the read across, and there are a couple of those. And then I think the point on road traffic accidents and so on, I think what we're trying to be clear about is the things that we are focusing on next year, which we believe will have a biggest impact on that. So the work around connecting Oxford and all the work that we're doing with the county designed to reduce traffic and the movement is the strategic kind of focus of the delivery next year, which is why that appears in the business plan. But that's not to say there's an exclusion of other projects, work to develop policies and interventions that are also going on.
Okay, thank you very much, Caroline. Nigel, to come back to you and your half dozen points.
Okay, I'm happy to go now.
Yes, please do. I think we should hear them.
All right, okay. Well, just as a general comment, Susan and Caroline, I thought it was a pretty good document. Can I just say that? I mean, no one's really given you sort of any feedback as a whole or what they thought about it. And I think it's pretty good and it's pretty clear. There isn't very much that's particularly new or surprising in it, which is kind of reassuring in a way that this is kind of steady work going on. But every now and again, there's a few tantalizing moments. And I suppose I want to talk about the tantalizing moments. I thought it was quite interesting as an observation that the Oxford transport strategy should be presented under economics and inclusion rather than zero carbon. And normally we've, I think, measured on it being a sort of zero carbon initiative primarily. Of course, there are economic benefits as well. But towards the end of that paragraph, there's a tantalizing reference to the inclusive economy principles of our economic strategy and taking account of them. And I'd like to hear you a little bit more if you could explain that, because the logic of what you're saying there is that if these proposals damage inclusion of our economic strategy, then we would be very skeptical about them. That must be the logic of that reference. So I'd just like you to maybe to elucidate a little bit more on that if you could. My second request really is that there's a lot of talk about strategies about housing in here and a new strategy for homelessness and housing, which again, I quite understand. There's nothing very precise about the numbers of homes that we're going to build. We have a target over 10 years of 1,100 new council houses, but it's not broken down anywhere as to what to expect really in the next year. And I would really like to see something a bit more precise about that. So at least there's some sort of benchmark at which we can assess our progress towards the mega 1,100 figure, which we have agreed over 10 years. So that's a request really. My third area is the urban forest strategy, which has sort of been vaguely talked about, in various fora, but doesn't seem to be very precise as far as I can tell at the moment. And I wondered how far it was dependent on external funding, point one. So it needs a big fill-up of external funding. And two, it's a request really and a recommendation I think that I'd like us to make, which is if we're going to have a strategy like this, we're going to build more trees, we have to maintain them. And at the moment, there's a significant mismatch in my view between the resources of maintenance and a very inflexible tree policy, can I say, and aspirations to plant and nurture lots more trees, which I support, obviously, and most people would support that in the city. So there's a bit of a tension here about building, planting versus long-term maintenance, which I'd like us to maybe make a recommendation about. And finally, my last point was about the waste strategy, which is something close to my heart, wearing my previous Cabinet hat, which was just starting to get going last May. There's a rather odd reference to street littering in this, which I found, again, slightly strange, because the waste strategy stuff's always been about recycling levels, frankly, and about recycling the right way, and about recycling with the right incinerators through the county and all of that, and not making it too expensive. And that's really been its thrust. And suddenly to have a reference to reducing street littering, I found kind of odd. So I just wonder whether that was a new idea that had come up, or how it linked Caroline and Susan to that proposed revamp of strategy, because it's more of an ASBO kind of arguably thing than a waste disposal matter. So I was getting a bit nonplussed by that reference, but I'm sure you can shed light on why it's there, because it's very specific in the text. So those are my 4 areas. Thank you.
Over to you, Susan and Caroline. Who'd like to pick?
Yeah, I'm happy to sort of come back in on those. I mean, I should have said I've obviously endorsed what Caroline said in response to Linda's points. I didn't really have anything to add. So in terms of Nigel's points, firstly on inclusivity and transport, I mean, I think with all of these things, there are often different places in the strategy and business plan that these things could sit. It was certainly quite an important part of the economic strategy that we just have been consulting on, talking about transport. And the reason for that is that if we don't do anything, our city will grind to a halt. So you know that is going to have a pretty big impact on the economy, full stop. So you know it is an economic issue, but of course it's much broader than that as well. It's an inclusive issue in lots of different ways. The poorest people in our city don't tend to drive cars. They are often bus users, and you know, making it easier for people to get around our city by bus is certainly one of the aims of the strategy. So that's an important point. And obviously it needs to be more affordable as well, by the way, because at the moment getting around our city by bus is pretty expensive. So that is an important inclusivity issue. It's also inclusivity around health issues. So again, the poorest citizens in our city tend to live in areas of high air pollution, and you know, that is again something that we need to tackle, and therefore I think it is very much, from my perspective, an issue of inclusivity. But then, of course, I think the point you were actually trying to make, Nigel, is looking at it through a slightly different prism, which is making sure that the work that we do on improving transport connections across our city, and making our city zero carbon, or in terms of transport, or as close as we can to get there, we need to make sure that we are not discriminating against particular groups, whether geographically, or whether people with particular protected characteristics, including people who have disabilities. And I agree with that, and that's certainly something that we have pursued very strongly with the county council in terms of discussions about transport policy, because you know, we are keen to make sure that the very poor consultation work that has been done by the county council so far is improved, and that we have genuine inclusive dialogue with different communities across the city, but also that we are taking on board the different issues that are made by different groups, so that we can address them and make sure that transport policy works for everybody. So I hope that answers that particular point.
Well, it did. I'll, if I may let you finish, and then I'd just like to just come back on that, if I might.
Of course. In terms of the housing target numbers, I think that's not for this report. I think that's more for the KPIs one.
Yeah, that's what I meant. Sorry, I meant.
Yeah. So I think that one. I think that's why that's not sort of explicit here. I have to say, on the urban forest strategy, I am not, this is not my area of expertise at all. Lubna is the lead on this particular strategy. I my understanding of it is that it is absolutely about not just, how many more trees can we plant, but what's the suitable trees for suitable areas. Sorry, too many suitables there, but what are the right trees for each area? How will they be maintained? Who is going to be doing the maintenance? But also, again, going back to the inclusivity point, one of the things that we have done is to map where trees are in the city, and it is not perhaps a huge surprise to find out that the wealthier areas of the city have far more trees than the poorer areas of the city. So one of the things that we are quite deliberately trying to do is to plant more trees in areas which have had fewer in the past. And I would also add that it shouldn't just be about planting trees. We have actually planted something like 10,000 additional trees in the city over the last 10 years or so. I may have those figures wrong, by the way. That's just me trying to get them off the top of my head. But we have planted a lot of trees, and therefore there are not many places left where we can plant lots of trees. There are a few places where we can plant a few trees, and we're definitely keen to encourage people to plant them in their own gardens where they can. But it is also about biodiversity more generally, and making sure that we have got the right kind of biodiversity across our city. And then finally, on the waste strategy point that you raised, I think I'd agree with you that it doesn't feel like it's in quite the right place. So if you can point us to a page number on that, Nigel, because I have to say I'm flicking through different bits of paper.
I think it's 41.
Lovely. I think we could take that one away.
Could I just come back on the inclusive issue? Because obviously you've got inclusion issues as defined by the Equalities Act of 2010, and I quite get that point. But I'm as concerned about people who run, small businesses, single operators who have to travel around the city to do their job, joiners, plumbers, self-employed people of that kind. And I am worried that there is a risk that in our desire to tackle air pollution and climate change and all those things, that we make the economics of their business much more difficult. And we don't, therefore it's not inclusive actually for them, it's exclusive, and it damages them. And they're often people who are quite close to the edge economically. They're living from month to month, they're earning a wage for doing a job. They've got to get around the city, and I just worry that they're not front of mind enough, if I can put it that way, when we're thinking about all the people we have to think about when we consult, and we have to bear in mind the trade-offs that come from restricting, for very good reasons, but restricting the way people move around the city, because we have other higher aims or different aims to try and achieve, which is around pollution and health and all those things. And that's what when I think about inclusive, I just think more than about protected characteristics. And I really think whoever's working on this area, if they can assist the county to think about that in some way, I think it would be very, very helpful, and also ultimately more convincing in the end that, all the trade-offs have been thought about.
Well, can I just say that on that very specific point, I raised exactly that point when we had the briefing from the county on the latest iterations, because I agree with you, Nigel, and if we don't get it right for that group of people, then it's not going to work, because we have to find solutions that will enable people to do their jobs, and so we do need to be talking to people. They need to understand what the proposals are. They need to be listened to in terms of how things might work for them, what support they will need, and how they can get around the city in order to do their jobs. So I absolutely
they can't always pass the charges on to their customer. I make this final point. This is in a context of rising petrol prices, rising utility bills for many families who are just about making ends meet at the moment. They're not the very poorest in our society, but they're quite close to the edge. And I don't know, I'm sure you, Susan, and I, and all of us who've been out on the doorstep, it's been really coming home to me really strongly how fragile the economics of these people's lives are, and therefore I would hate it if our well-meaning and well-intentioned transport plans effectively made them significantly poorer. So that's the point I'm making. That's all.
Could I just, because I think from what you're saying, Nigel, is I think in some senses that that is why it belonged. I think why we plumped in the end, because you're right. This could have sat in a number of places through the document, but sitting in the inclusive economy priority, and also there's a reference, and perhaps we can look at the wording if it's not clear enough, that tries to relate it to the inclusive economy principles of the economic strategy. So I think from what you're saying there, if you're looking at it from that perspective, there is a good case for it to sit here in the document, but perhaps we need to draw out a bit more clearly what we mean by inclusive.
That's exactly right, Caroline. Yeah. It's just a bit gnomic at the moment, and that's why I was raising it tonight, because I was trying to understand what the reference meant really. Now I do understand. It's much clearer to me. Thank you.
And then I think my tuppence on the littering, which I agree is probably a little bit specific, but I think rather than the antisocial behaviour angle, that's a recognition that the strategy for waste and recycling in the city is also about public facilities for doing that. And so as part of the strategy, looking at is the provision of bins and so on conducive
availability,
to minimising littering.
Availability. Yeah, I get it. Okay, thank you. Really, but generally I was very impressed with the document. I thought it was bloody good, can I just say? Thank you.
I'll pass it on to Mish.
Can I just make a comment which surprisingly dovetails with the one that Nigel's just made? I think I've been concerned reading this report about communication and looking at particularly at the Pursue Zero Carbon Oxford section and the transport strategy. There isn't much mention of communicating with the public. And the thing that we're hearing on the doorsteps, probably very similar to Nigel's doorsteps, are people are not being brought with the council on the work that's being done in terms of moving them out of the centre of Oxford. They are worried about it, and they don't feel that they've been heard on this. And I feel communication is actually something that needs to be pushed much harder if people are to come with us. We're asking them to make big changes in their lives. And I just wondered what your comments were on this, Susan or Caroline.
Well, I'm glad your budget bid didn't succeed then to cut the communications team, but that's what my immediate thought. And also, I mean, I think, frankly, a lot of the communications that you're just talking about there are actually the county's communications and engagement, where I think there's been a lot of failure. But yeah, you are right. Having said that, communications is a key part, particularly in terms of pursuing Zero Carbon Oxford, and actually was one of the things that came out quite strongly from the Citizens' Assembly, was that people said, you know, we didn't know some of this stuff. We would have liked to have known, and also, you know, we didn't know about all the different opportunities there were within Oxford to do things differently. And every time, and I think that is really important, and that's one of the reasons why we made sure that there was money in the budget for communications, because it is absolutely crucial to everything that we do, that people actually understand what is on offer in the city. So things like, you know, repair cafes, that's a really valuable way of stopping people throwing stuff away. And you know, that's, as we know, the first rule is reduce, isn't it? But then reuse, and then recycle. So you know, that is a very important part of communication. And I have to say, I think at the moment, in the light of the, you know, terrible situation that many people in our city and across the country are going to be in terms of energy costs, trying to make clear to people the help that may be available to them in reducing those costs and improving insulation in their homes is going to be another really crucial bits of communication that we can give to ordinary citizens across our city to make sure that not only are they doing their bit for the planet, but they're also saving themselves some energy costs and their fuel bills.
Okay, thank you. Everybody, sorry, Chris, would you like to speak next?
Thank you. I just wanted to, there's one of our proto recommendations, which I wanted to specifically push back against, which is, or maybe just a nuance, which is the point about consultations, which was brought up in the context of the dreaded words, the LTNs. So the reason I'd like to push back against it is because when it comes to effective consultation and respecting the outcome of consultation, there's several bits of that which I heartily agree with and which I think we could all agree with regard to making sure that if there's things that have been missed in the course of drawing up plans, that those are drawn to our attention, making sure that everybody is very well informed about what's potentially going on, making sure that problems are seen in advance and corrected in advance, making sure we're catching exactly the sorts of cases that Nigel's talking about, of making sure that we design things which mean that if you are a tradesperson, then a reasonable cost may occur, but that people's businesses are kept viable. All of these are things that I think we could all get absolutely on board with. But the main way in which that particular consultation could be said not to have been respected is in the sense that it is an unpopular policy, which by all appearances, probably, maybe, obviously we don't completely know yet, but probably the county looks to be angling towards going ahead with anyway. That's the main way in which that consultation could be said not to have been respected. And if what we're getting on board with is that a policy has to be individually popular in order to be implemented, then that is probably something which would condemn a lot of Connecting Oxford, which are things which this strategy is making broadly warm sounds about at the moment. The reason for that is that a lot of parts of Connecting Oxford are about encouraging people not to use their cars. And a lot of people drive cars, and cars are great. Everybody really likes driving them because they're very, very convenient. So if you make a policy which tries to aim people away from cars, it's going to produce a lot of negative reaction. And that sort of approach will result in us never doing anything which goes along those sorts of lines. So I'm not even saying that any one of the particular Connecting Oxford policies or LTN policies is necessarily a good idea. Maybe they turn out to be bad ideas, maybe they turn out to be counterproductive. And if they are, then clearly we should reverse ourselves. But the basic principle that it's got to be popular in order to do it, which is, I think, the key takeaway from respecting the consultation in this case, rules out all policies of that kind. And I don't think we should be going there.
Thanks very much, Chris. That makes a lot of sense. Caroline, you'd like to respond, I think.
Yeah, I'm just on page 31, where it's talking about the Oxford strategy, Oxford transport strategy, workplace parking levy, extension of controlled parking zones, etc. It does say throughout the year there'll be extensive engagement and consultation with key stakeholders, community groups and residents to help shape the final proposals. So I'm just wondering, Liz, whether that captures what you were, your concern around that. If there are other specific areas where we, a reference to consultation would help. But I don't, you're probably right that we haven't gone through in every instance and said, in developing this strategy, we will consult. But on that particular transport one, I thought it was there.
Yes, it's as much about communication, about communicating rather than consulting that I was concerned.
I see. I see. Yeah.
I know that consultation has been brought up by some of the other members, but I was really concerned that actually people didn't know what was available and what the pluses would be, which is what Susan was able to expand on, and that was helpful. Linda, can we hear from you and then move on to the recommendations, because we've got several here and we need to deal with them relatively speedily.
Yeah, well, I'd still like a recommendation about firming up the commitment and the importance of consultation, and we could take it even further if we like. I mean, I completely disagree with what Councillor Smoten was saying. I think, you know, these schemes have to have the consent of the people most affected by them. That's just democracy, and you know, given the impact that these schemes have on people's day-to-day lives, yeah, I mean, you know, if people don't feel, if we impose these schemes without the consent of local people, then actually it's a very dangerous thing, and, you know, goes against our aims in other areas in terms of involving people in political and civic life, because people, it just adds to people feeling like they're not listened to, and that you know, democracy doesn't work for them. So I would like to keep that as a recommendation. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. Can we go through the recommendations? I hope I've written rather scrappily. I've written them down, but actually Tom Hudson will be able to help me out on this. I'll start with Paula, who talked about the issue of the university and big employers providing more accommodation, and Susan replied that this was a lobbying point that was taken up all the time. And I wondered if, Paula, you were thinking it would be useful to have a recommendation that we should continue lobbying the big employers in the city to provide more accommodation, but up to you. Would you like to come back on that?
My lobbying point that I made was not particularly about the universities. It was more about short-term lets.
Yeah, the sort of the Airbnb type of things. Yeah.
But that said, I definitely have a recommendation about lobbying the universities. I think that would be great.
Okay, right. So Imogen, you've got your hand up. Do you want to respond on
I was going to add myself to the end of the queue for a recommendation, but actually, strangely enough, my recommendation was going to be on lobbying anchor institutions more broadly, but I was going to use the university as an example. So where we're talking about reducing inequality, increasing cohesion, obviously in this context, town and gown comes to mind. When we're talking about improving our parks, obviously a lot of the land, a lot of green space where we could be planting trees is owned by universities. A lot of our leisure space that is underused in the summer when the students go home is owned by universities, is essentially privatized in usable space. So I think with a lot of these priorities, the universities, while we have minimal power, I can see the difficulties with lobbying them. They have a potential to have a huge contribution to the things we're tackling. We're trying to tackle in terms of improving our public spaces and opening them up more in this case, in terms of retrofitting, fighting climate change, all of those things. So I think I would like a recommendation to build in really pushing our anchor institutions on each of these points we make where relevant to play their part. So just as it's important to have comms that's educating the public, encouraging the public to plant trees in their garden or whatever it might be, we need to be really building in, pressuring our anchor institutions to really work with us here.
I wonder if we could combine your recommendation and Paula's, because you're both asking for the anchor institutions, as you call them. It's a good name for them, actually, to be lobbied on various fronts, housing, but also on provision of open spaces and accessibility for open spaces and so on, all these things. Do you think they could form one recommendation? I can't see you there, Paula, you're a rectangle at the moment, but yeah. Would you agree that the two recommendations could be put together, or should we do them as two
Yeah, I mean, up to you, Imogen. I don't mind.
Yeah, me too. Me too. That's kind of it's good timing.
Yeah.
For our brilliant chair to come to me, because it does tie in really neatly with Paula's. So hopefully that's not too vague for Tom to draft something.
Don't worry, Tom's on the case, I can see. So if we leave that one with him, and he will create the recommendation out of what you both said. Then we move on to Linda. Several recommendations here. Maybe not all recommendations, but can I just sort of give you the headings that I've got down, and you can tell me, Linda, whether these are recommendations and whether the form that you want is here. First one is about bathing water. It was a recommendation that information about water quality should be available to the public. That's a shortened form of what you were saying, but is that correct?
Not really. I think we can go higher level than that and just say that we update progress in that area and have regard to what comes next, regardless of the outcome of the consultation.
Okay. Tom, are you okay with that? Right. So that's the first one. The next one is about ox pens. You suggested there should be a recommendation about more detail being available about this development.
Yeah, well, my concern was just I wanted reassurance, really, because we've got the statement there that it won't be at the expense of the vibrancy of the existing centre. I was hoping to hear more about how we would be doing that, but I haven't really had that reassurance. So, you know, if perhaps the committee would want to make a recommendation about yeah, although actually I'm not sure that this is the place for it, but my concern is about what, you know, why are we we're not trying to make sure that we're not putting too much retail there and damaging the city centre. Whether that is too low level for this document, perhaps is.
Could we hear either from Susan or Caroline very quickly on that point?
Well, I was just going to suggest, yeah, I think it's perhaps, I understand the point you're making, Linda, and I think it was one of the dangers I was live to, that we could possibly fall into discussion of detail and how plans are progressing. So, you know, I think that it's probably not for this document, but I do take, you know, I do understand that what you're asking for is a fuller briefing on the plans for Oxpen and how their Oxpens on how they're going to deliver against that commitment. But I'm not sure it's about amending or writing all of that detail into the.
Okay, let's let that go then.
If we could.
So the next point was about the. Sorry, Chair, go on.
Yeah, I was just going to say that will be included in the minutes that Tom will produce, so that it's not going to be lost. Yeah, and the next point was about housing, a commitment to protecting public spaces, and that seems an important recommendation. I need to hear whether the committee are content with that recommendation to ensure that that's in the plan. It seems to me to be a high level thing.
Well, I would slightly check. I usually always agree with Linda about everything, but it's all in the nuances here, really. I mean, I don't. You can have a recommendation that says it will protect public spaces 100% in every case. I'm sorry, I couldn't agree to that, because it's a trade-off in the end. And sometimes you have to use public spaces, some part of it, to build affordable and social housing, given you have a land constraint. So I don't think it can be an absolute sort of guarantee. One needs to be very mindful of it, is the way I see it, but it's not a kind of 100% set in stone, never ever touch anything, etc.
I agree, Nigel, but I would like us to have a absolute commitment to protecting parks and play areas, council parks and play areas. I don't think that is too much to ask. So I'd like to see that as a recommendation.
I would be more, yeah, I would agree.
The committee doesn't.
Yeah, I'd agree to that.
Yeah, and perhaps also if we're going to keep that statement in there about sites valued by local people for leisure and recreation will be protected. Well, I'd like to know how local communities can demonstrate that to the council, so that their areas used for leisure and recreation are not threatened in the future.
Tom, I saw your hand was up. Did you want to say something?
No, don't worry. The conversation has moved on.
You sure?
It's all good. It's clarified.
Nigel, would that satisfy you? Instead of protecting public spaces, protecting parks and play spaces, and ensuring that there is a proper avenue for local people to communicate?
Well, yeah, well, it's more than that. It's a proper avenue for the views of local people to be taken into account when decisions of this kind are made. I mean, that's what I think Linda's really driving at, and
okay.
Yeah, something along those lines absolutely
Okay,
must be right. I mean, that can't, you must be right.
I'm resisting. I just wanted to make the point that, of course, that's what the policies of the local plan and the planning process is designed to do. So I don't know.
Yeah. Well, that's a big conversation, Caroline. Designed to do. I watch your lips carefully there, right? Yes.
Well, that's where it's set out. So I'm just
it's where it's set out. That's right.
You can't use the business plan to completely undo or something that was taken, years in the development of the local plan. That was my point.
Yeah, fair enough.
Next point, Linda. The recommendations I've got down is about including a consideration or exploration of a youth council being set up.
Yep.
Does everybody agree that's a reasonable recommendation? Caroline, did you want to comment, Caroline? No.
I'm resisting the attempt to try and answer Scrutiny's questions about their recommendations. So I think that's a fine recommendation.
That's fine. Okay, fine. Then the next recommendation you made was about safety for road users.
Flagging up the importance of road safety, as well as the decreasing congestion and improving air quality, and bringing down road traffic accidents should be a goal as well.
Yes. So that's your recommendation. What does the committee think about that recommendation? Would you be happy to let that go forward? I'm seeing some nods.
I would, if I may, Chair, I would agree with it. And I think actually Linda said something really quite important in addition, which I'd quite like to see included, and that was about HGVs. It is not a coincidence that out of the last 5 fatalities, cycling fatalities in the city, 4 were left hooks by HGVs across cycle lanes, leading to 4 deaths. And I've got big questions about it's actually not the big Arctics, actually, it's medium size, it's bin lorry size vehicles. Big questions about them, and particularly about the mirrors on them. I've got a question into council actually on the 21st about this. I think it's not just about cycling infrastructure, although it is, it's also about large vehicles on narrow roads. So I'd quite like to see that included, that specific element of road safety included.
Okay, are we happy about that? Any objection to that from the members? Okay. And finally, there's the recommendation, which is contested, the one you put forward, Linda, about the importance of community consultations. And we need to consider how that goes forward, because what Chris was saying was rather different. He didn't want the community consultation to override a policy where the policy was central to the future of what was being done. Is that right, Chris?
I mean, not quite. It's more a case of, I think we're fairly explicitly asking for a consultation to be treated as a referendum, to be in effect direct democracy. And I completely take Linda's point about wanting to do that as a high priority and being something that we keep firmly in mind. I just feel that when it comes to policies relating to car driving, that weds us to going where the prevailing wind is blowing, and that means fundamentally, because cars are very, very popular and very, very widely used, it means that cars will remain king, fundamentally. And for that reason, I don't think it's good policy in this specific area.
Can I make a comment?
Yes.
When I was first elected, it took me a while to realise what consultation in local government speak meant. And it means a different thing from how most of the public understand it to mean. what it means in local government speak is this is what we're planning to do. What tweaks would you like to see? There may be early stage sort of consultation, which is more brainstorming and stuff like that, which is along the lines of, I mean, in this specific example, the movement of people and goods into the wind within the city will have improved, resulting in less traffic congestion, etc. That's the outcome that's desired. In the particular case of LTNs, nobody objecting has actually addressed the issue of how you do that by other means. You know, so the problem is that isn't a consultation. You know, so that's the first thing. The second thing is that consulting people is not the same as agreeing with them. And there's quite a lot of people who said they've not been listened to. And I could quite easily reiterate exactly the points they've made to demonstrate that I've listened. But the point is what happens when you don't agree? So there's a thing about that. The last thing about consultations is that because we have a completely chaotic system with different policies coming in all the time at different places, dependent on different funding streams and all this kind of stuff. I mean, you know, just to take LTN as an example, I have lost track several times of when a consultation was happening. They've appeared out of nowhere. There's been simultaneous consultations going on about the same thing. It's been absolute chaos. You know, if one's going to do consultation, then I think there needs to be a much better we may have a policy on this somewhere about community engagement. I have a feeling we had one a few years ago. You need to start with the sort of, here's the problem, how are we going to deal with it? That's not consultation, that's sort of brainstorming, public meetings, whatever. Then you move to a gradual process of, okay, well, this is what we're looking at, you know, equivalent of our Regulation 18, Regulation 19 with planning. And then you gradually evolve it. And you're clear about every step, and there is only one consultation running at any one time by one group of people. Now, if you did that, I think people would feel included, and if you get the communications right, so people can engage at an early stage. I mean, how many times have councillors had to go back to people complaining about particular developments and say, look, I'm terribly sorry, but this was basically decided 4 years ago. You've missed the boat. You know,
Nick, thank you very much. I think we do have to move on, I'm afraid.
More nuanced in a recommendation about consultations, about what the overall process looks like and how we can engage better and make it less chaotic. So I think, you know, what I'm saying is actually both and, but we need to perhaps do a bit more work on that before we make a recommendation.
Yeah, okay. I hear what you say. I don't think it's directly to the point of the recommendation, but it seems to me that we've got three quite different views from the three people who've spoken on this. So I don't want to bring it forward as a recommendation, unless we have a very strong majority in favour of this recommendation. And I'm reluctant, having fallen into this pit before, of having a recommendation that's not supported by a very large majority of the group.
I was trying to find the middle way, Liz, but maybe that doesn't work.
Well, the middle way is often very unsatisfactory, I'm afraid, in a situation like this.
And also, actually, I think, to be honest, look, I've heard the conversation and I realise there's different emphases going on actually here.
Yeah.
But actually, in the document, when it talks about the movement of people and goods in and within the city and etc. So it talks about consultation in that context, extensive engagement, consultation with key stakeholders to help shape the final proposals. Now, you can read that a number of ways. I mean, you know, it's sufficiently ambiguous to be helpful in the sense that a final proposal can be a no.
Yep.
It doesn't have to be a yes. It can not go forward, you know, or it can be adapted a bit, as tweaked, as Dick talked about earlier on, and evolved over time. So it doesn't rule out throwing things out after public consultation, nor does it rule them in. It just says, you know, we'll consult, we'll take into account, and that's what we do. And therefore, I think the way it's drafted is reasonable, actually, personally.
I suppose
I'm not supporting a recommendation. I'm supporting you, Liz, that there shouldn't be a recommendation about it, because I think it.
Yes, well, I was rather hoping that you were, but I slightly lost my way towards the end, Nigel, which is my fault. I don't think we should bring this forward as a recommendation, and I'm sorry about that, Linda, because I can understand what you're saying, but I don't think that I don't think that we've heard supportively from enough members of the committee at the moment.
Can we revisit it, Liz, at some point?
Sorry?
Can we revisit it at some point? Because this really goes through a whole load of stuff. It goes through planning, it goes through a whole load of stuff. It's the whole process of engagement.
I mean, that's what you were talking about. And it is part of the stuff.
Lengthy process of
I mean, what you're saying isn't often ventilated because there isn't space for it, but I think we should. But I don't think this particular juncture at 7:30 on a Monday evening is the point for it, sadly. Nigel, can I move on to your recommendations? As far as I can see, it comes down to the open forest strategy. And you may feel that has been covered by what's been said by Susan, or you may want to bring it forward as a recommendation.
Well, I've got two I'd like to keep if I could. I was happy about the street littering stuff that was going to be looked at again, and I was happy about the KPIs around housing numbers. I was happy about that. That's fair enough, perfectly reasonable answers.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I'd like to say that whilst Scrutiny welcomes the reference to the inclusive economy principles of our economic strategy and looking at transport proposals, it urges Cabinet to be mindful, or words to that effect, of, in particular, the potential impact of those proposals upon small businesses and sole traders who need to travel extensively around the city to carry out their business.
Yes.
I'd like to do something along on those lines, because I do think they are the forgotten people a little bit in this story.
Yes.
And they're not covered under the Equalities Act, as I said, of 2010. They're not part of that at all. So that would be helpful. And the other one was, again, whilst welcoming the proposal to have an urban forest strategy, urge Cabinet to review the scale of the budget given to maintenance of trees in the city, and to review the tree policy in the next 12 months, because it's due for renewal, and I think it needs to be reviewed personally, because it's out of date in some areas and it doesn't take account of this, particularly the growth of trees in the city. So something along those lines, Tom and Liz, if you could fashion those two, I'd be very happy. And the rest, I'm happy to take the comments of those who are, as it were, have answered our questions tonight, Susan and Caroline.
Is the committee happy with those two recommendations? I can read them out again, but you've heard them very clearly from Nigel. Okay, I don't see anybody dissenting, so yep, we'll go with those. And I think that is the end of the council recommendations. Okay, so thank you very much, Caroline. And Susan, I don't know which of you will be presenting the COVID recovery and renewal network next thing on our agenda, and we're grateful to you for your patience.
I will start, and Caroline can correct me when I go wrong. I mean, actually, I hope this can be somewhat briefer. It's a very high level framework, which grew out of the joint working that we did during COVID with our fellow councils across Oxfordshire. And also, and I kind of referred to it earlier, some of the work that we've been doing, particularly around the inclusive economy, which I think you can sort of see to some extent, at any rate, running through this particular framework. And it's just it's there to better align the kind of strategies that we are bringing forward as councils across Oxfordshire, so that, you know, in future working we will continue to work well together. I think from my perspective, it does sort of allow us to have some influence beyond our borders, shall we say. So, you know, some of the things that we have been on, and I have been banging on about a lot for the last few years around inclusivity and around sustainability, I think are in there. But it is a very high level framework, and, you know, I think that's pretty much all I want to say about it, really. I'm happy to answer specific questions if people have them, and Caroline might want to add something else.
Would you like to add something at this point, Caroline?
Just briefly, because I think Susan has covered it, but as well as this being going to our the other councils in Oxfordshire, it is also going forward to propose to be adopted by other partners, including the LEP and health bodies, and is reflective of the kind of close working relationships that we have built through COVID. So there have been a number of systems meetings bringing all of multi-agencies together to focus on the response. And I think there is widespread recognition that we want to build on the traction that we've built and ensure that we've got a framework for doing that going forward. So it is also going to those other organisations, and it will also be going to the Health and Wellbeing Board, where I think they will want to consider how do we as a partnership report back in the future on this framework. But as Susan says, it isn't about binding us in terms of dictating to our policies, but it is a commitment that we will all collaboratively continue to work together across the system on the three priorities, which are about consolidating recovery, and I think there's a key element of that, which is about the inclusivity discussions we've just been having, focusing on health inequalities, really shone a light on as part of COVID. And then it's called Sporting Renewal. It's really about resilience and supporting communities and building on the big community response that we saw during COVID. So I'm hopeful that this will make our continual attempts to engage with those partners across the piece on the priorities that are set out in our strategies. This will give us a stronger forum in which we can have some of those conversations.
Thank you very much, Caroline and Susan. I think we're looking at the future in this framework, and that makes me very happy. I see it as a bridge between the current partnership COVID response and longer term partnership planning. And that has to be positive, I think, for making things work effectively. We've got questions, first from Hosni and then from Nigel. Hosni, would you like to go first?
Yeah, thanks very much. And I mean, there's obviously a lot to like about this, because clearly what is being aimed is to engage the anchor institutions so that we can get them to do some of the great work we've been doing in the council around inclusive economy, around focusing where focus is needed, all the work we're doing, council tax reduction on housing, etc., etc. But I just we have just been having the child poverty review groups via Scrutiny, and a few people here are on that committee, and you can see on the next page that up to actually the 1 in 5 is actually 1 in 3 in wards like mine of children living in poverty. And unfortunately, despite all our best efforts, partly a lot because of central government and legislation that's already in place, this figure hasn't changed for quite a long time. It has slightly changed, and it's got better in some wards, but in certain wards it's very, very persistent. So though I think overall the material is all there, I would love for this document to really change focus, and it's not really doing it differently, but it's just saying we as a Labour council, Labour-led council, really believe that we need to tackle poverty in our city, and these are the ways we're already doing it. We do so much work within our own sphere to do that. But it's really trying to get all those other institutions, I mean, we can call them partners or anchor institutions or whatever we want to call them, to come on board. And that includes the big employers, the university, the hospitals. And one of the ways, and I really would love to see that change in focus there. If you're looking at the very first page, the priority outcomes, for example, and even at the end of the first page around the outcomes, it was kind of like the inequality says it's a theme that runs throughout at the end. I would love it to be just literally number 1. And then when we talk about the inequalities, it's saying, use a person and family shaped approaches to align activities and promote more joined up community development. I would just like to see the focus shifted onto employers, etc., and things. And just I do quite a lot of work on race and health. We're about to run a race and health course with Health Education England, and the term resilience, when it's talked about communities, is often basically saying, kind of accept inequalities, and why don't you come on, toughen up, like why don't you, I know that's not how we want to use it, but there is certainly that kind of implication there in the use of the term. I know it's become very, very fashionable, but on the other hand, I do think it's a term that can be problematic because of the emphasis on away from structural inequalities and towards people. So then just a couple of, so then from the Child Poverty Review Group, one of the things we're looking at is how could we possibly embed a structure to deal with some of the issues that we're already discussing. And as we know, we do quite a lot in our own council. One of the ways that has been looked at before by the previous Labour government was to run a socio-economic duty alongside the equalities legislation, and that would essentially bind any public institution to, in all their policies, as well as doing equalities impact assessments, would be to look at socio-economic duty. Now, if we were to do that within our own policies, I believe it would literally be a tick box because we're already doing that. But I do believe that, unfortunately, for example, the colleges, I'm not talking about the university as just the name, the university, I'm talking about the colleges where a lot of money is spent. I don't think they are really. I think they give us a few crumbs here and there, but I really don't think the colleges are that engaged at all with either making our city safer or making it less unequal. And I think we need to somehow give us a structure with which we can kind of go at them repeatedly. And I know you are anyway, Susan, you probably are doing this repeatedly, but it would be good to have that structure. And I would like the leadership to consider embedding that within this document, but we can talk about that separately as well if needs be, because it's coming by the Child Poverty Scrutiny Committee. And then just a couple of just smaller points on the healthy place shaping. I think that would be the perfect place to talk about creating cooperatives and democratizing. I've mentioned this before to the healthy place shaping team, and I know the funding is quite specific, but I do think that it seemed like almost the community's work is separate from the healthy place shaping, but that needs to be together because it makes no sense kind of separately. Anyway, I'll stop there. And then the last thing I was going to say is Health and Wellbeing Board. I really think that a big part of this is going to be done. The integrated care boards are going to be talking about inequalities as one of their first, I think it's one of 5 priorities. So in a way, having this document, because then that can also be another place that we can, because it is going to be a massive change in the health infrastructure. And I've said this elsewhere in another committee, but anyway, I'll just stop there, and I'll be very happy to chat more about all of this, or that's another forum. Thank you.
Susan and Caroline, would you like to respond to that now? Would you like to hear the questions or comments from Nigel and from Paula, and then respond to all 3 of them together?
Shall we do all 3 together? I think.
Okay, fine.
Save time.
Yes, Nigel.
Yeah, I've just got 2 observations really. When I read it, I mean, I obviously know it's a document about sort of responding in a post-COVID world, and it's framed that way. But it's slightly naive. It's just slightly off true, really, when it talks about health inequalities. And going back to Hosnia's point, really, it's sort of you can read it to believe almost that health inequalities didn't really exist before COVID, and then COVID came along and created them all. That's just not true. I mean, there were massive health inequalities before then. COVID exacerbated them. It didn't create them from scratch. And I think that the framing of the document needs to be, somebody needs to go away and read it and think, would I get the wrong end of the stick? Because it always talks about addressing the unequal impact of COVID-19, to give you a heading on page under point 8, to give you a specific example. So I just think whoever wrote it just needs to be a bit more mindful of the history of what was happening about health inequalities before COVID, point 1. Point 2, absolutely endorse what Hosni said about, I mean, wearing my partner hat. If you gave me this document to read and I was wearing my NHS NED hat, and I was involved in an ICB or an ICS, I would think this document didn't really understand that. Just did not understand the extent of the change in the governance of the health service, which is going to happen after July the 1st, and the responsibilities that are placed upon those bodies to tackle health inequalities among, as Scotty said, one of the key 5 priorities of the NHS, in the NHS plan. So, you know what I mean? It's just, it just doesn't ring out. It doesn't get it. And I think it's missing a trick. And it kind of, its prism is rather local government-y, if I can put it that way. And it's sort of about, it sees partnerships rather as a local government thing, which is, that's kind of old thinking. You know, it's old thinking. The new thinking, and Susan knows this professionally, even much more than I do. This revolution is about partnerships across emergency services, health, hospitals, and local government, of course, working together to tackle these scourges upon our society, which have been with us for far too long. And I just feel the document, whoever wrote it, just needs to go away and think a bit more about that and put that in, because my final point is, if you play this out to a partner as your sort of prospectus or manifesto of working together and what you're going to try and achieve in a post-COVID world, it's just not touching the buttons quite right. It's not acknowledging enough their role working with us. And therefore it could be kind of, they just think, oh, well, you know, you just don't get it, do you? And they'll just ignore it. So that's the risk here. So it's some redrafting to take account. The recommendation would be something like redraft to take account of the changing health landscape, and in particular the major changes in governance of health, which will come into effect from July 2022. Something along those words. Or Caroline, you could just agree to go and do it. We don't need to have a recommendation. I mean, you know, I don't mind either way, really.
Okay, Paula, can we hear from you? And then we'll ask Caroline and Susan to respond.
Yeah, well, yeah, fortunately mine kind of echoes, I wanted to echo what Hosnia was saying as well, because like we're in a time where there's like so many crises going on, whether it's the climate, the pandemic, the decade of Tory cuts, and like the rising inequalities of that. And I think we do need to be a bit more ambitious with our approach, because as a council, we can't do it alone. So I think that, you know, we do some really good things, like the great campaigns of, like, you know, the Oxford Living Wage, where we went above and beyond the Living Wage Foundation and recognise Oxford is a really expensive city, and you know that kind of filters out to the city employers, and I think that's great. And I can't see why, like, we could do similar campaigns around things that can push landlords and institutions and companies in the city that can do their bit, because they've got a lot of money, and you know, we need to have a bit of, like, you know, a better relationship in that front where they're actually putting in as well, because then that helps the economy. And similar with community wealth building as well, it kind of, yeah, we just need to retain some money so that, like, you know, people can afford to live here. So yeah, that was kind of just building off what Hosnia and Nigel were talking about.
Thanks very much, Paula. Susan, Caroline, would you like to respond?
Yeah, I've got a lot of sympathy with what's been said about the document. So just a couple of things to kind of remind people: this isn't our document, and it's not about the City Council. So you know, we didn't write it. It was created by the county, right. And you know, I think it shows. So, bluntly. So, you know, we've got some stuff in it that we would want to have in it. And, you know, I talked earlier about the fact that, you know, this is, it's been good to get people in the county to be talking about an inclusive economy and, you know, tackling health inequalities, etc. But it's not necessarily come naturally. So I think, bluntly, I'm not entirely sure how much we can change in this document, and I'm wondering whether Caroline can help us with that. I'm happy to try, I have to say, because you know I do agree with the points that you're making. I think it, in particular, actually, Nigel, on your points in terms of it just not really recognising the current health structures. I mean, I think that's the sort of point we could go back to them with and hook some other stuff on the back of, because actually also it is the hook which might get us into a better discussion around health inequalities and inequality generally, because of the very reason that you were suggesting, that it's an opportunity, there will be obligations on ICSs to be tackling health inequality, and that is a big part of the NHS going forward. And Caroline was quite right to kind of remind me that this is actually supposed to be a health document as well as local government, and it does rather feel that it's slightly missing. I mean, I do think there are some opportunities there because, frankly, and speaking as somebody who works in a health trust, this isn't necessarily the sort of document that health trusts are generally looking at either at the moment. There are some points being made in here, particularly about economic inequalities, which I don't think are sufficiently recognised in health at all at the moment. And Hosnia was making that very point. So I think I think you're all making really good points. I would love to be able to take a lot of them on board. I'm not sure quite how much leeway we will have. Caroline may be able to tell us more.
Thanks, Susan. And apologies. I meant to say this in my introduction, which is this is one of those partnership documents, which I know Scrutiny have asked questions about this type of document before. We have at officer level, and Susan, in the conversations with other leaders, had a number of conversations about it, and I think actually we have managed to move it quite significantly from where it first was. Nevertheless, it is one of those documents which is going through each of the partners, and therefore attempting to rewrite it or send it back to the drafting stage at this point is probably not going to be feasible. That said, we have got agreement this time round that where changes are agreed, is delegated to myself and my fellow chief exec colleagues to be able to make some changes in the final published version. And I think Nigel's point about reflecting emerging governance of the ICS probably reflects the fact that this document was actually drafted in I think it was around November, and then it got delayed by Omicron events. And I think that we've got a bit more clarity now. This is the same group of people that is working on what that new governance means and looks like for Oxfordshire. So I would have thought that getting a reference to that is one of those changes that we should be able to incorporate. I also understand and recognise a lot of the other comments. I think what maybe Scrutiny might want to think about is, what its recommendations to us as a city council and what we do with this might be, rather than attempting to get more things built into the document. Because I think we will want to continually be making the points that have been raised here and ensure that they are recognised. I'll go back to what I said before, that the overarching benefit of this for me is if it in effect ties all those bodies who are it's a greater lever to all of those bodies who are signing up to it to come together and refer to this as a framework. So sorry, that wasn't very clear, but what I meant is not signing it is probably it's less advantage to the things that we're trying to pursue through this. And I think that if all of the organisations sign up to it, we have a reference point to which we can keep coming back to people. So when we do want to talk about the particular issues for the city, we can try and use this framework as a means by which we get their engagement.
Thank you very much, Caroline. You'd like to come back, Susan, and then Hosni would like to have a final word before we decide what we can do in terms of recommendations that would be useful, because you've been very open about the fact that this report is slightly off-centre, isn't it, in what it's doing, but whether we can do anything about it.
I mean, sorry, I wouldn't say it's off-centre. I think that if we had written it, we would want it to do a lot more and be a lot more city specific. Yes. But it is about the whole of Oxfordshire, and it is trying to bring a bunch of partners who've not had this type of framework to bind us a bit closer together in how we work together moving forward.
Thank you.
I think what you should think about this document is that for us as a council, this describes the bare minimum of what we do. But what we're doing with this document is dragging to the table some organisations and councils who wouldn't necessarily have signed up to some of these objectives were it not for the fact that we have done quite a bit of influencing on this document and put in concepts like inclusivity and health, tackling health inequalities, and those. So I think it is important to recognise that. I just really wanted to build slightly on the point that Caroline was making about there being other fora in which we could address some of these points. So, for instance, there is a joint meeting coming up very soon between the Future Oxfordshire Partnership, formerly known as the Growth Board, and the Health and Wellbeing Board. And I imagine that many of the same topics will be covered at that, and that may actually be a more productive forum for raising some of the more detailed points that were being made earlier during the discussion. But Hosni also was talking about some of the work that we could and should and are doing as a council, and I think absolutely all of those things are really, really important. So the work that's being done in the child poverty group from Scrutiny will be invaluable to us as a council in terms of developing future policy, and we also are working very hard, and this kind of follows on a bit as well from the previous discussion, to try and get Oxford colleges to do more to tackle some of these issues where they have got the power to do so. And some of them, I may say, are really stepping up to the plate, and others really are not. So, we will continue to do that work as well with, various different institutions and big employers around the city. That won't necessarily be flowing from this document, but it is part of our core work as a city council.
Thank you. Hosni, you'd like to come back on this?
I think just for the future of Scrutiny, it would be helpful to, when we have an external document that we don't have that much control over, it'd be nice to have that just flagged so that we keep out, you know what I mean, we keep that in mind when we're reading and thinking about recommendations, etc. I think that would just help with the flow of scrutiny committees generally. I know we've made this point a couple of times. And secondly, thanks very much, Susan. I think, yes, it would be great to take this up. Obviously, elsewhere, it seems like this is a document that I guess the even maybe suggesting that, or trying to put in somewhere that a structure needs to be embedded that, I don't know, something vague like that they might agree to, which might leave the door open for a future via a strategic partnership, a future suggestion around, whether it's procurement, whether it's generally socio-economic duty, anything like that just leaves the door open. I don't know how you would word it. I haven't obviously sat through how this document was developed. It might be worth adding that just to leave the door open around it with the other partners that are looking at this document. And yeah, and of course what Nigel mentioned around, what we were talking about, the integrated care boards, I'm sure they would be open to that as well. But yeah, it'd be good in future to know that our hands are tied.
Thank you very much, Hosni. I think you're quite right. We possibly need to make it clearer, even putting it on the agenda for the meeting, exactly where we stand with the various plans and policies that come before us. Caroline, you'd like to speak?
Apologies again, because I had meant to make that point in my introduction, so apologies for that. I wonder whether there's a couple of things which might help. Firstly, and I'm thinking about the sort of things that I could take, and I think would stand a good chance of, being agreed. Firstly, I think the point about this sort of not constraining or being the only sort of strategy or policy that we're trying to take forward. I mean, on the page 2. It says that it's not a replacement for existing county-wide plans and strategies. And I think maybe on reflection, the county-wide element of that is perhaps suggests it's only talking about things which cover all of the county-wide geography. And perhaps if we could look at the wording for that to say that it isn't a replacement for, their partners' individual strategies and so on. And I think that gives us the ability to highlight that actually we've got elements other plans and strategies which do go further than this. That might be something. I think the other point, I had another point which I thought might, it was Hosnia's point that she made earlier about looking at the language to see if we can rebalance it to reflect the fact that yes, COVID may have worsened inequalities, but actually what it's done is highlighted the severity of existing inequalities. And what I think what we're trying to say here is actually what COVID has also done is brought us together as a set of partners to properly look at and understand the data that currently exists across the system in different agencies. And we now look at that together and decide actions together. And I think something that says, recognises the point that actually it's highlighted inequalities rather than created, invented them. And secondly, that approach to how we use analysis and data is a key area in which we can help our response going forward. I don't know if that's helpful.
Yes, that's really helpful. I think that's been a really good discussion, and what's come out of it for me is that maybe recommendations that we might make aren't necessary because they seem to have been taken very much on board by Susan and Caroline. In fact, with quite a lot of them, I think they were there ahead of us probably. But I'd like to go back to what Hosni and Nigel both recommended and see if we need them as recommendations, and if so, how to phrase them. Hosni's was a very wide recommendation. She was talking about a change of focus, where we put at the centre of this policy the fact that we believe that we can tackle poverty in the city. I don't know myself if that's appropriate given the discussion that we had following your recommendation, Hosni, but I think I need to come back on it.
I mean, that sounds like it might be ambitious and it might not get through, and I don't want to waste officers' time going back and forth. I think, it's across the county really, but it just does sound like our hands are tied because of the nature of the way it's been designed. I'm happy to leave it with Caroline and Susan to do what we need, because I think we're on the same page. In a way that is manageable, because I think if I try and give a form of recommendations that doesn't quite fit in, it's just a waste of time constantly going back and forth, because I can imagine.
I think that makes sense. I mean, it would be, I can hear something in the background, but I don't know if it's relevant. It will be in the minutes anyhow, so that it'll be flagged up, as a concern that actually tackling poverty in the city is something that we as the city councillors think are absolutely vital, even if it's not right to have to completely change the focus probably of this document that we've got here. So I don't think you had any other comments that came over to me as recommendations, but if you have anything, tell me now. Otherwise, I'll move on to Nigel. Nigel, you were talking about the report needing to be framed differently because it's not just about post-COVID, as you've said.
Well, I think to be fair to Caroline, she's more than got the point. Okay, so that's fine, and can go back and also talk about the partnership stuff as well.
Yes.
In a new health framework, which has moved on since November and has got a definitive start date now of July the 1st. And things, whether you like it or not, with ICSs and ICBs, they're the fact of life. They're going to be operating, and it's the vehicle through which a lot of these issues are going to be tackled. The other point I'd make, Caroline, you touched on something very important about the working together. It's partly about the sharing of data and information as well between the various parties, because you don't just see someone's poverty in inverted commas through a health lens or through an economic lens or whatever. You have to see it linked together. And that's part of the whole point about the ICSs in the end. You can't tackle health inequalities by just looking through a health prism. Otherwise, we just leave the system in place. And otherwise, wouldn't be part of it. That's the realization that's come about, like it or not. And therefore, I think that's something that you could wheedle that line in about sharing of information, data, perspectives, I think it might be a hook that you might help people to gel together, because that's part of the aim of the new act, actually, in the end. So I don't really want to make specific recommendations. I'm very happy to leave you to get off and write subtle things and nuanced things. Having heard our conversation, do your very best to persuade those who are not quite so enlightened to come along on the journey.
Can I just mention monitoring of what happens with this report? Will that come back to scrutiny in due course?
You mean to be a sort of review, Caroline, about what impact it all had in a year's time or something?
Yes, that's what I mean. We'll need an update, won't we?
Otherwise, you've got no idea really in the end whether this.
No, I mean,
it's a very good question, Liz, and it's one that has certainly occurred to me at various different stages of this particular process, is how one would monitor this. And it's another reason why I think that Caroline's point around, you know, whether scrutiny want to make it a particular recommendation or not, about the city obviously still being, you know, developing its own strategies, which may very well go considerably further than this framework in terms of tackling some of these issues. I don't think that's properly set out at the moment. I don't think I can answer that question for you, if I'm honest, at this moment. You know, this is very much something that has been driven by the county, and we will have to wait and see how they think it could and should be monitored. But I'm sure it's something that we can report back on as and when we're clearer on that particular point.
Right, so we don't need a recommendation. It will be coming back to scrutiny anyhow in due course.
No, I don't think that is clear, Liz. I think, you know, as I said, it is going to the Health and Wellbeing Board, which is also considering what role it plays in the future of the ICS architecture and so on. I don't think the intention around this is to create a whole bunch of KPIs or reporting industry on it, but it would seem to me that saying that partners who are signing it would want to report, say in a year's time, about what happened as a result would actually help keep the focus on, you know, not just signing up to the document, but actually what differences it made. So I think we would want to do that in a way that was, you know, not too burdensome across the system, but perhaps if there were a report that went back to the Health and Wellbeing Board that could equally be considered by council scrutiny committees in the future, that would seem sensible and might help to keep people focused.
I think that would be a good recommendation, so I'm happy to propose that. I don't know if I've got support of other members of the committee.
No, well,
support. No, Nigel.
You have, and maybe just to help on with some words. Maybe it's something around, you know, in the next, at the end of the first year, review the impact of the report and how far it facilitated the city council in carrying out its ambitions in relation to health inequalities and blah, 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 blah. Something like that would be, because in the end, if it's got any value at all, it's meant to be an enabler. If it didn't enable much and we just carried on doing our own thing and it frankly just gathered dust on the shelf, we might as well know that, because, you know, we just need to know that. So something along those lines, Caroline, if you could, and Susan, if you could bear with something like that, I would be very happy with something along those lines.
And maybe even something like for partners to consider a structure that would enable, you know, like the, you know, maybe socioeconomic duty, if you can, you know, I don't know whether it still probably won't go through, but you know, to tackling inequalities, maybe a tool, to consider a tool for tackling inequalities, such as the socioeconomic duty, in order to focus attention on, you know, something on those lines. But again, I'm well aware that this might not work.
No, I think that's fine. I think we can make the recommendation as wide as it is and put in lots of examples of things that we would like to like to have monitored in a year's time. So yeah, if everybody's happy, I'm going to leave it to Tom to draft it, and then it will come back. No, it's not going to come back to us, is it? It's going to go to Cabinet on the 16th, Tom? Yep, Tom's. Yep.
That's right, Jay, yeah.
Oh, but we'll see it before then. Okay. So thank you very much, everybody. And thank you particularly to Caroline and Susan, because you've been very generous with your time and your energy this evening. And we're grateful.
Yeah, we are. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Process,
Thank you. Been a good couple of discussions.
Yeah, thank you. Good discussion. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for coming and for your wisdom about all these points. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. We'll scarper now then.
Yeah.
Good luck with the rest of the agenda. Cheers. Bye.
Right, and thank you. Right, so moving on, work plan. I'm going to hand this over to Tom.
Yes, Joe, really, there's not much to say about it because we've only got one meeting and there's very little coming up, going forward to Cabinet next month, etc. But I actually wanted to use this opportunity to highlight a little bit of what I was hoping to get you to start thinking about, which is for the work plan for next civic year. I need to start collecting ideas of what members think would be useful topics for consideration as part of the Scrutiny Commission reports. So I'm not going to ask you to do that tonight, but I will be contacting you in due course just to say, you know, please give some thought and some ideas as to what you might want to see coming next year for scrutiny stuff. Also related to that, not quite on the work plan, but I will also be sending around something put together by the a self-assessment tool or a self-evaluation for scrutiny put together by the Centre for Governance and Scrutiny, which will just give me an idea of how we rate against best practice and the areas that scrutiny might be less strong in and the areas that it is strong in. So I'll also be sending that around. It's really not very onerous, but yeah, that will be coming your way as well. And if you could get it back to me, that would be much appreciated.
Thanks very much, Tom. I'm afraid that I've overlooked the minutes. That's the problem about doing things out of order, is that I forget the numbering. So we have to approve with any amendments that you want to make the minutes of the 1st of February. We're not going to look at the minutes of the meeting of the 2nd March. They'll be agreed at the April meeting. So that's on the way away, but it's the 1st of February meeting, which we need to approve. I think, Dick, you've got some amendments you want to make on this. Is that right? I haven't got them in front of me at the moment.
Nor have I. I'm just going to try and find them. Okay. Yeah, it was. Oh, I've got it actually. Yeah, it kind of relates to. I think I'm in the right minutes here. The recommendations to Cabinet, and it's drawn actually out of the report of discussion that precedes it. In fact, so it's pulling stuff that was already in the discussion. And it's about the recommendations. So that's page 12, I think, on our. Let's just find that on our reports. Make sure I've got that in front of me. Hang on, bear with me. I think it's down the bottom. Yeah, it is. It's down the bottom of page 12 on our PDF. We've got the one recommendation in there, which was about a brief supplementary report. This is about basically helping the public be able to digest this stuff. And we had a discussion about the importance maybe of when the consultation report comes, people being able to identify where the consultation responses had been coming from, you know, so that people could actually see, you know, for example, to take one classic example, you know, these points that came out in the consultation, were these being made by developers, for instance? or by the general public, that sort of thing. So I got a minute to suggest, which was actually a second recommendation that follows the first one. So you change the numbering, presumably down the column. I'll read it. I did send this through to Tom as a possibility, and I think I can maybe soften it a little bit. The council requests that the supplementary report, that's the one referred to in the previous bullet point, identifies consultation responses by respondent type, so that members and the public can understand where particular respondents, and I would add, or groups of respondents, are pressing for particular policy choices. So it's not necessarily about naming particular respondents, but it's about saying this is where the pressure for this particular response was coming from. I think that was said in the discussion, and I think it's quite important, actually.
Yeah, that was certainly said in the discussion.
For the public to be able to understand what has actually happened in that consultation.
Yeah.
That's my memory of what we talked about.
Yes. Does anybody object, or are we all happy that that's included in these minutes?
I can put that in the chat if that helps. Let me just do that.
I don't think you need to. It's a very clear addition, actually, and okay. It's to say that we need to know who the people and the organisations were who commented.
Yeah.
On every item. Yeah, that's clear. Okay, thank you. So that's the amendment. Otherwise, with that amendment, can we approve these minutes of the 1st of February?
Fine, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
We might as well just deal with it now and say that, do I take it that that's also to go in into the report as well? Yep.
Yes, please. Yeah. And so going back to the agenda, we've done the work plan, and we're now on to 8 reports for approval. We've got 2 reports, the procurement report and the Oxfordshire Plan 2050. And this is where Dick's amendment to the minutes will also be part of the report going to the cabinet. Okay. So we've got the procurement one first, and we had a large number of very good recommendations. I've got them in front of me. There are 7 recommendations here. They're all very, very clearly preceded by a preamble of which Tom has prepared. I've been through it, it looks fine to me. Does anybody have comments or queries or concerns that they'd like to raise about this before it goes to Cabinet? Everyone looks happy or worn out. I don't know which, can't tell from here. Right, and then we're on to the Oxfordshire Plan 2050, okay? And that, of course, was a very complex discussion. And at the end of it, at the final paragraph, paragraph 17, further consideration, is where it set out that there needed to be further discussion, that we felt that even after the couple of hours that we've been able to spend, we were really just beginning to crack open the nut of Oxfordshire Plan 2050 and wanted more information. What's happening about this, and maybe this is a good moment to mention it, but you will all have received from Alice, I think, notification that there's going to be a further scrutiny committee. It's not actually going to be a briefing, it's going to be a scrutiny committee. And it's on the 14th of March, so I'm afraid it's another Monday evening gone, guys. But this is very important because we've got some interesting people coming to talk to us who I think will help us to establish some of the issues that we might want to turn into recommendations for Oxfordshire 2050. So the briefing is going to be 6 o'clock on the 14th of March. We've got Nicholas Falk, the architect, who produced, what's it called? It's the Urbed plan that he's produced, which is very interesting. And he, I think, will be talking about how best growth in Oxfordshire should be accommodated. We have got Nigel Moore, who is an expert who has worked on the numbers, which we've got from the Ogna plan. I don't know what his view is on them, but it would be interesting to hear an independent expert speaking. We have got, who have we got apart from that? We've got Ian Green, who is the chair of the Oxford Civic Society, who has been working on the plan for a long time and is very knowledgeable. And apart from him, we have Rachel Williams, who we've heard already, who has been very central to the creation of the plan, and Adrian Arnold, of course, who is our head of planning. So it's going to be quite a busy evening listening to these people. We think,
and also Alex Hollingsworth.
Oh, I'm sorry, yes. Yeah, I should not have actually forgotten Alex Hollingsworth, and I'm sorry about that. But the idea is that everybody, including Alex, will have up to 15 minutes. They may not need that long, but they've got that long to talk to us. And then it'll be questions and answers. Because we are the Scrutiny Committee, we can ask the questions. There can be observers there, but they can't ask the questions. So anybody you know, any other member, for instance, who has a burning question, should put it through yourselves at that meeting. Okay. It was intended to be a public briefing, effectively, where all 48 members could attend and could ask questions, but that became a bit unwieldy. So this seems a more effective way forward, and I hope it's going to work. I'm looking forward to it anyhow, because there are all sorts of questions which we started raising at our previous meeting about the 2050 plan, and I think we're going to get some answers to them. That's going to help us a lot. And then the next scrutiny meeting at which we're going to consider this will have to be after the elections. So it'll probably be June. I hope it'll be June, because as you gathered when we were talking to Rachel Williams, there is a certain amount of demand that we should deal with this as quickly as possible. But on the other hand, they say that they want us and the other scrutiny committees, and there are quite a lot of scrutiny committees involved in this, to have as much time as possible to actually look at this, so that we're not just rubber stamping something, we're actually giving it our brains. Okay, so that will be probably June of this year, with most of you, I think, present here. So anyhow, that's the plan at the moment. And as I say, I'm looking forward to it, because I think it will shed some light that we don't have at present. Sorry, back to where we were.
Can I just, sorry, Chair,
Yes,
can I just make one small observation about Tom's very good paper? Therefore, I would say, in the further consideration, on top of the scrutiny, the extra scrutiny committee meeting taking place earlier this week, I wouldn't say, as you say, it's not an all-member briefing. And secondly, it's not just on growth figures. Can I just say it's about the whole set of issues. So let's just frame it that way, or write down that we're framing it that way, because we're not. Actually, we're asking for a whole series of perspectives about more than growth. So I'll just make a small edit there, Tom, if I were you.
Fine. It was reframed after Tom produced this. Because initially at this stage it's going to be a briefing.
That's right. No, that's right.
No, that's fine. I think that's right to reframe it. And the other recommendations, there are two kinds of recommendations, and I hope everybody's happy that they go forward in the shape they're in. Nobody wants to add or amend anything else at the moment. Okay, fine. Thank you very much. Right. So we'll move on to item 9, report back on recommendations. There are some confidential recommendations, but I don't think that we need to go into confidential session unless somebody raises a question that can only be discussed or answered if we go into confidential session. And if we need to, we will, but I'm not expecting that. Then the BRG, the Budget Review Group, James Fry isn't here, but Tom is. So Tom's going to speak to it. So I'll hand over to you, Tom. Thank you.
You'll be relieved to hear that I don't plan on going through every single recommendation, but suffice to say, there was only one recommendation that was actually refused, and the vast majority were agreed. You will notice some saying, they normally say agree, disagree, partially agree. There are some saying not applicable, and that's simply in relation to the fact that the budget review group did ask for clarifications on certain things rather than making specific recommendations on them. So that's why that's happened. I mean, largely what came out, sort of the advice centre reinstatement actually happened prior to the budget review group stuff. That's probably one of the big sort of outcomes of it. I would encourage you to look at the restricted recommendations, and particularly I think there is some interesting and quite important stuff that comes out in relation to the ODS depot. So I would just encourage you to have a look and acquaint yourselves with what's said, because I think that's quite impactful and will influence things in the future. But I won't go into detail because it's a confidential session, because it's still a public session. But yeah, that's kind of the feedback, I think, probably. And I'll hand over to you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Tom. Unless anybody has got questions either for the confidential, Dick, is this about the public information or about the confidential?
It's about the public. It's just a comment about the recommendation that was refused, which was about the use of consultants on biodiversity and stuff like that. I mean, I think I'd quite like us to monitor that one. At one level, this is about money, really, about whether it's actually cheaper to have in-house capability. And I don't know quite how detailed our accounts enable us to be, but it would be very interesting to track what we end up spending on biodiversity consultants, because the planning rules have changed. My feeling is it's going to be a lot of work, and it would be cheaper to have in-house capability. And I'd quite like to see that monitored by Scrutiny, because if they've said no, we'll use consultants, and it actually turns out to be horribly expensive, and it would have been cheaper to have had our in-house. I mean, there's other reasons for having in-house as well, but I don't need to go into that. I just quite like to see that our recommendation is actually followed up by just monitoring what actually happens.
So are you talking about a report coming forward in, say, 12 months' time? I don't know what I'm talking about. I haven't really thought that one through, except that I suppose when the accounts are looked at, you know, it would be quite nice to think maybe Tom could make a note that we could be prodded to just look at the retrospective accounts and see what we actually spent on biodiversity consultants. You know, I don't know what's possible, Tom, is it?
Could I make a suggestion that actually in the budget setting process that happens before Christmas, that's fed back to the planning people to review as an area to look at, to see whether there are potential savings to be made, because I'm sure that they'll welcome any possible savings that they can find.
I think that would be very helpful, Tom, because then, yeah, it also enables a discussion about whether it's actually better to have in-house experience building up as well. Thanks.
Okay, Tom, thank you very much for that advice. Can you minute that we're going to be doing that? That's great. Imogen.
Yeah. So it's on recommendation 13. Which is that so far as it's practically possible, the council ensures that energy and efficient homes are prioritised for retrofitting, notwithstanding the complexity of the task. I'm basically just flagging that the response wasn't altogether reassuring. The response being that it was repeating what the budget already said. So that they are prioritising to the extent they can, but that it may be more appropriate to demolish and build new homes in some cases where energy efficiency C can't be achieved. And it's frustrating to me because this recommendation was about making sure that the least energy inefficient homes won't be waiting the longest to see any improvement. And it's one of those difficulties where targets are an important tool, yes, but they can have the side effect of demotivating us to do work that won't contribute to meeting them. but is nevertheless important. So in this instance, say a property is rated F, but can only realistically be brought up to a D standard. This wouldn't meet the targets, but it would still improve the lives of the tenants who live in the properties in the meantime, while we're waiting for longer term solutions. And that was kind of the point that was made in budget review group, was that we're trying to make sure we're thinking about the tenants who are in some of the worst quality housing, who are living with black mold, who are cold over winter, whose fuel bills are going up and up. If those homes are ultimately going to have to be demolished, what's going to happen in the meantime? Are they going to be prioritised even if this target can't be met? So that was the point of the recommendation. And I suppose, I know we can't go back and forth on these things, but I just wanted to flag that this recommendation didn't quite do what we wanted it to. And I hope that Scrutiny can keep a close eye on developments and ensure that we're kind of balancing qualitative and quantitative considerations as we improve our housing stock.
I think we should minute your concern, and that we should come back to it in the same way as we're going to come back to the point that Dick has raised. At some stage, it's probably going to be 12 months away, isn't it, when we're clear as to what's happening. You're right, we can't bat things back and forward, although I'd often very much like to. But
could I just, could I just get some quick clarity? Was that recommendation agreed that they'd go forward with it and then it got retracted?
No. Do you want to say? They've agreed with the recommendation, but the recommendation, from what Imogen says, isn't actually what was asked.
I suppose they've agreed with it, but they're agreeing with what they were already doing. The way they've agreed with it actually brings up the problem that was trying to address. They just restate the same attitude that recommendation was supposed to be trying to address. That's partially my fault. It's because in the process of simplifying a recommendation into a kind of a sentence, you sometimes lose some of the context, but that context was there in the meeting. I wonder if it was there in the report as well. So I'm just not happy with the response, and we should maybe be wary of it and monitor that these tenants aren't being left behind and slipping through the cracks because of target setting. I think that's something people should be aware of, and yes, it should be minuted. Thank you, Chair.
Great.
Okay, thanks very much. Okay, so that's the could we move on to Linda at this point? If you'd like to give us an update on the Housing and Homelessness panel, Linda.
Yeah, I will. Thanks. My connection's a bit dodgy, so I hope I'll last the course. So we met on the 2nd of February. We were going to look at the Cabinet paper on the allocation of homelessness prevention funding, but that was published too late in the day, so that's why it came to the main scrutiny committee, and we had the discussion here instead. So instead, we didn't look at any Cabinet reports, and we heard a lot more about the work of the tenant involvement team, and we heard about preparations that the council is making ready for to get ready for the housing the social housing bill, which the government is looking to bring in, which is likely to put a lot more duties on the council in terms of tenant involvement in the running of housing services. So we're looking to publish a bumper report on that, on making recommendations about the council's response to the social housing bill. So we haven't been making a lot of recommendations while we've been going through the year, but Tom is currently working on writing up a report which we hopefully will be able to sign off on our next meeting, which will now be the 22nd of March. It's moved. It was going to be the 4th of April, but it will now be on the 22nd of March. So which will hopefully which will give more time for to be published and for members of this committee to read it and digest it and think about it before it's ultimately signed off here by Scrutiny Committee.
Very much.
But thanks to Tom for all his work, and he's going to be very busy writing up our report in the next couple of weeks. So I really appreciate all his his support on that. Thank you, Tom.
Thanks very much, Linda. That's great. Hosni, would you like to give us a quick update on the Child Poverty Review Group?
Yeah, looking at the time, I'll keep it very brief. I've already spoken a bit about the work of the group when we were asking questions from Susan and Caroline. Essentially, we have been looking at a whole range of both, hearing from a range of local groups, organisations, and also some national experts, including Naomi Eisenstadt, who was a really inspiring woman who has actually started the Shore Start Centres, a very senior civil servant who has done a huge amount of work in this area, was at our last meeting. And essentially the work is developing in two parallel strands. One is about how the work of the council and the work it does with voluntary organisations, including faith organisations, can be directed to better, to be coordinated better, to in effect approach this really important issue and treat it and give it the attention that it needs. But it also is looking at how do we embed the structure such that it really does tackle, we do see some changes in the next decade. And that's what I was speaking about just now, about the socioeconomic duty. Thank you very much to everyone some of whom are here. Dick, who's been subbing for Lucy quite a few times because of our odd times of meeting, and Liz, thank you very much for all your contributions, and of course Tom, who's been doing a lot of work on this. So we're hoping that we've got another meeting coming up tomorrow and then one in a couple of weeks. So I think Tom will be following one report writing with the next, and then hopefully we can go from there. But also in the meantime, I'm also doing some work behind the scenes, for example, with the chairs of the strategic partnership to see what structural changes we can make, because this is not something we're going to be able to resolve on our own within this council, but it is a huge topic and of absolute vital importance. So if you have any questions, please do get in touch with us. The papers are actually published on ModGov, so you can have a look. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Hosni. Dick, you've got a question? No, it's just a legacy hand. Okay, fine. Okay, so finally, dates of future meetings, and I've mentioned the 14th of March, which we know about, and the next one is the 5th of April, and that has the great advantage that it's going to be in person. So we'll actually see each other before we all break up for the elections. Okay, so that's it for tonight.
Can I just raise one issue, just quickly, that we've got a number of scrutiny panels coming up around the companies.
Yes.
And unfortunately, on the 24th of March, I'm in London, and I've got a major thing to chair, and I'd be pushing it to get back for 6 o'clock, to be honest. So can I have your permission to ask James Fry whether he would chair that session?
Absolutely, if you need it.
This is an insurance policy, really, in case I just don't get back, which is quite possible, given the trains for the moment.
You said the 24th?
Yeah, the 24th. It's the one covering OCHL, OXPENS, etc., the non-ODS stuff, basically. So if are you going to, Tom? Are you going to write?
I'll contact him.
Just explain that I just need. I may be all right, but I may not, and I don't want to have a chairless meeting. That's no good for people, really.
Yeah.
Okay. Anything anybody else would like to raise? Feel free not to, and we can all go and have supper. Okay. Right. Good night, everybody, and thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. No, it was good discussions. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.